Vanna looked up to the lady in the black dress who was checking on the mental state of some cultists. The lady noticed her gaze, raised her head and gave a slight nod in acknowledgement. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, but there was a maturity beyond her years in her demeanor. Her black hair was coiled up at the back of her head, and the pale blue crystal earrings on her ears reflected the gas lamp's light nearby. "Is Heidi here too? Did the city hall send her?" Vanna asked the young guard at her side. "No, Heidi happened to be nearby when the incident happened and came straight here. Is there a problem?" "No, not at all. Heidi may be an employee of the city hall, but she has long-standing cooperation with the church. She can simply register her presence at the scene later." Vanna shook her head, quickly refocusing on the task at hand. As she examined the dead cult priest, she casually asked, "What did the cultists who can still communicate say? What exactly happened?" Their words were very chaotic. Two of them mentioned that the normal sacrificial ceremony had already ended, but suddenly someone near the assembly caught a fleeing sacrifice. So the messenger decided to offer this sacrifice to the sun god. The guard recounted as he recalled, those two cultists stood far away from the altar and didn't see the specific scene on the stage. They only mentioned that the sacrifice was heart-pierced but didn't die. Instead, he shouted the name of the sun god and directly designated the messenger as the sacrifice. As a result, the messenger was sacrificed. A person chosen as a sacrifice, shouting the name of the evil god on the spot, directly sacrificed the person presiding over the ceremony? Vanna felt as if she were hearing some fairy tale and found it absurd. But since the words came from a highly trained, loyal church guard, she had to take it seriously, which made her expression strange. How could such an outrageous thing happen? If this could happen, wouldn't the victims at many cult sacrifice scenes be able to counterkill those heretical priests if they were quick with their words? You're right. Even the clumsiest of priests dominate the ceremony. How could they be easily controlled by an ordinary person's words to such an extent? Besides, we've checked this priest. He indeed has traces of erosion from the deep projection of the world, a true baptized one. And according to the cultists at the scene, he was even holding a blessed ceremonial dagger at the time, the young guard said as he shook his head, then moved on to another body nearby. But, take a look at this. This is the sacrifice who counterkilled the priest. Vanna glanced at the guard, then her gaze fell on the lifeless body. The next second, her gaze sharpened. It was a frail young man, so thin that he looked more like a boy. The most noticeable abnormality on him was the gaping hole in his chest. He's already been sacrificed. Yes, this is a sacrifice that has been offered. According to the scene and the cultists' testimonies, this sacrifice probably lost his heart before being pushed onto the stage, the guard said solemnly. So, the real situation at the time was that a walking corpse went up the stage in front of everyone, killed the priest presiding over the ceremony as a sacrifice, and caused the ceremony to completely lose control. A trick of the necromancer? Vanna mused. No, the power of the Black Sun greatly restrains necromancers. The corpses they control can't just walk up to the totem of the Black Sun. Are they revived under abnormal control? Have you checked the light around here? She suddenly looked up and asked the guard, within a range of 500 meters, is there an underground space that is completely dark? We've checked, and there's no lightless cave. Even the cultists know the danger of a lightless cave. They've left torches and oil lamps in the caves where they discard bodies, being very careful in this regard. Vanna didn't speak for a moment, but bent down in front of the young man's body with a heavy question in her heart. She carefully examined this sacrifice, who had sacrificed a transcendent in front of everyone and caused the ceremony to completely lose control, and tried to find traces of heretical power left on his body by flipping his stiff eyelids. Suddenly, she seemed to see a flash of light in the corner of her eye. She seemed to see the young man's body slightly opening his eyes, with a ghostly green flame jumping in his hollow eyes. A tiny spark was ejected onto the fingertip of her right index finger and then dispersed with the wind. Vanna's eyes widened, and she immediately took out the dagger from her waist with her left hand and without hesitation cut off her right index finger. Then she nailed the dagger to the forehead of the corpse. The priest's dagger engraved with runes suddenly burst into flames, completely engulfing the corpse. It took her less than a second to do all this. The moment the corpse was engulfed in flames, she had already straightened up and retreated 2 steps. She then took out the blessed holy oil from her waist, bit off the stopper with her teeth, and poured the oil on her right hand, which was bleeding profusely. The holy oil came into contact with the flesh and blood, and immediately hissed out a lot of white smoke. The heart-wrenching pain surged up, but Vanna's face remained unchanged. She saw the guard who had been following her draw his sword quickly, cut off the head of the sacrifice that was burning fiercely, and then threw a mixture of seaweed extract and silver powder into the fire, accompanied by continuous explosions and flames that rushed high into the sky, almost licking the ceiling. The mutated corpse turned into ashes in the blink of an eye. And this spectacular fire did not spread to the other bodies nearby. The surrounding guards had already reacted. Half of them drew their rune swords and surrounded Vanna, while the other half drew their large-caliber revolvers and quickly formed a perimeter. The two priests at the scene also drew their revolvers hidden under their robes, blessing the muzzle with the censer while chanting the name of the storm goddess, Gamona, and constantly pointing the muzzle at the cultists who were going crazy and agitated due to the changing environment. "Judge!" The young guard with the sword finally came to Vanna. "Are you okay?" Just now, there was some kind of power remaining in that sacrifice, and this power bypassed all the protections given to me by the goddess, even my psychic warning. Vanna waved her hand, her gaze falling on her right hand. The goddess's grace was taking effect, and her severed index finger was wriggling and slowly regenerating. But even as the pain gradually subsided, she didn't feel any more at ease. Something's wrong. There's more than just the black sun here. A powerful force may have visited this sacrifice ceremony, and this force hasn't completely left. It still has something to do, the judge quickly judged. Move all the people and evidence away, take them to the church and keep a close watch on them. All subsequent checks and interrogations will be conducted in the church, and the scene here will be thoroughly purified. Are there any other people around? A guard immediately answered, "Yes, we previously rescued a batch of intended sacrifices who were being held captive in another nearby cave. They are currently temporarily placed in the nearby pipeline. Take them away as well, take them to the church. Even though they are victims, they must undergo a strict check before they can go home," Vanna said quickly, and then seemed to suddenly remember something. "What about Miss Heidi? Is she okay?" "I'm here," a calm female voice finally sounded nearby. The mental doctor, in the black dress, came over leisurely, nodding at Vanna. "Don't worry, I didn't react at all just now. So what exactly happened?" Like many classic stories tell, the cultists have provoked something even more sinister. Vanna glanced at the mental doctor. "I strongly suggest you take extra precautions when checking these cultists and hypnotizing them. There's a power that should not have appeared here, and it's still lingering." As night faded away, the pale scar that occupied the entire sky began to gradually dissipate. Alexander stood at the stern deck, looking up at the sky, not missing any detail of this moment of day and night transition. That he saw the scar becoming transparent and illusory, just like a slowly awakening dream. The gray-white light fog around it first merged with the sky, followed by the body of the scar. And throughout this process, the position of that scar never changed. Alexander blinked, a speculation gradually surfacing in his mind. The fact that the scar in the sky hadn't changed its position, could it suggest that it's not some distant astronomical structure? Could it be some kind of imprint on the backdrop of the atmosphere, a phantom that moves in sync with the boundless sea? Or could it be that the planet where the boundless sea is located and the scar are in synchronous orbit? Or maybe the scar is moving, but it's not noticeable due to the short observation time. Various conjectures rise and fall in his mind, but Alexander is well aware that without sufficient evidence and reliable experimental verification, these conjectures are just that, conjectures. There could be a myriad of possible explanations behind a natural phenomenon, but without theoretical and evidential support, everything is just empty talk. The sun rose first, a golden glow appeared at the horizon of the sea, followed by a large luminous structure emerging abruptly from the sea. Accompanied by brilliant and splendid twilight, the light sphere locked by the double rune structure appeared in Alexander's view. As the rune structure slowly operated, the sun rose solemnly. This majestic process seemed to have a certain sound, a low, powerful, and slow roar echoed in Alexander's mind, but when he really concentrated on listening, the sound suddenly disappeared. He frowned, somewhat doubting whether he had just experienced an auditory hallucination, but the memory brought by that sound was so vivid that he couldn't deny it. Was it an announcement made by the sun to this world as it rose? Or just one of the many illusions brought by the boundless sea? No one could answer Alexander's doubts. The vast and boundless sea kept all its secrets as always. Pigeon AI, as usual, squatted comfortably on Alexander's shoulder. Suddenly, it stood up, flapping its wings vigorously, looking at the sea and chirping loudly, "Get some fries. Get some fries." Alexander couldn't help but laugh. He glanced at this quirky pigeon and suddenly felt that having such a bird around wasn't so bad. The weird words this pigeon blurted out from time to time always made him feel a sense of homesickness. Unfortunately, there are no fries on the ship. He casually flicked the pigeon's beak and turned towards the captain's room. "But you're right about one thing, we need to get some food." A moment later, the captain of the Wanderer prepared the traditional breakfast of the ghost ship for himself. Inside the captain's room, Alexander directly used the navigation table as a dining table, placing several plates on the empty table next to the sea chart. Today's breakfast, like last night's dinner, last night's lunch, and every meal in the past, was dried meat, cheese, and boiled water. Alexander sat at the navigation table, ceremoniously laying a napkin for himself. The unicorn head quietly sat opposite him. To his left was the cursed doll Isabella, who had come to greet him early in the morning. The peculiar pigeon squatted on the table to his right. Alexander suddenly felt that this scene began to match his persona as a ghost ship captain, the goatwood carving representing the devil, the cursed doll that couldn't be discarded, the articulate bird that knew the knowledge of another world, and the ghost ship captain sitting in the main seat, all of which could serve as a movie cover without any editing. But only the people involved knew the reality of the food situation on the Wanderer Alexander sighed, looking down at the food in the plate. The movie poster-like opening scene was over, and what followed was the real life of firewood, rice, oil, and salt on the Wanderer. He picked up the dinner knife, cutting hard into the cheese. The sound of hard friction squeaked. Then he used a fork to poke the dried meat next to it. The collision between the dried meat and the plate made a crisp sound. Isabella, curious about this scene, finally couldn't help but ask, "Captain, is today's meal the same as yesterday's?" "It will be the same tomorrow." Alexander looked up at the cursed doll. "Do you want to try?" Isabella thought for a moment, picked up a piece of dried meat with her hand, put it into her mouth and chewed hard a couple of times, then immediately spat it out. "It doesn't taste good at all." "You wouldn't be able to eat it even if it tasted good. Do you have a stomach?" Alexander reached out and took the half piece of dried meat left in Isabella's hand. "I let you try and you really did." Saying this, he looked at the food in the plate with a touch of worry again. The only food that could be found on the ship was this. The texture of the dried meat was like salted cardboard, the cheese was like loose wood mixed with sand, and no matter how it was processed, there was a strange taste. He had tried to boil the dried meat or roast and fry it, but despite the effort, he couldn't improve the taste and texture of these things. The good news was that the food, at least, wasn't rotten and wouldn't poison him. The bad news was that the power of time had turned these non-rotten substances into a state that was extremely not recommended for swallowing. Alexander had every reason to believe that this cheese was several years older than him, and those dried meats, if they were still alive, had witnessed at least a century of ups and downs. The captain of the Wanderer may not have to worry about scurvy, but Alexander still longed for a healthy diet. At least, he hoped the food in his plate could be younger than him, the same age would do. The Wanderer's supply plan and land exploration plan that he had thought about yesterday came to his mind again. But these can't be achieved in a short time. Alexander sighed, continuing to cut the firewood in his plate with a vengeful attitude. AI, who had been tilting its head to watch at the side table for a while, curiously came over. The bird first looked at its master, then at the food in the plate. "Crystal mineral reserves are low." Alexander looked at the pigeon, casually pinched some fallen cheese crumbs and threw them to it. AI pecked at it a couple of times, then suddenly froze like a computer crash, not moving at all. The bird was frozen for a good 3 or 4 seconds before it suddenly started moving. It flapped its wings and flew to a shelf nearby, making a frustrated noise. "Even if I starve to death today, die out there, jump down from here, I won't eat." Alexander felt a bit hurt, while the unicorn head on the other side of the table, which had finally been quiet for a while, couldn't help but start making a creaking noise again. Before it could set itself on fire, Alexander nodded. "Speak if you have something to say." "Yes, Captain." The unicorn head finally got the chance to speak and immediately started chattering. "I've been wanting to ask since yesterday, is it called AI? Why can't I always understand what it says? I thought about it all night yesterday. What does recharge Q coins mean?" Alexander raised his eyebrows. He really didn't expect this unicorn head could hold back until now to ask. He actually underestimated this thing's self-control. "You don't have to worry about it. This bird's thinking is very weird." Alexander didn't stop the woodworking in his hand, but continued to make the sound of chiseling and sawing with the knife and fork in his hand and casually said the excuse he had thought of long ago. "It seems to use a set of language that only it can understand to communicate with people. Listen more and you can guess what it means." "Is that so?" The unicorn head pondered, "but I always feel that there seems to be some logic hidden in its words, as if behind that language hides a complete, self-consistent knowledge." "Did you find AI during your walk in the spirit world? Could it be a projection from the deep depths? As you know, the deeper the place, the more likely you are to see projections from misaligned time and space, which include some lost ages we have never understood, and even fragments of the future. Maybe AI is talking about another time and space." Alexander's cutting work in his hand paused for a moment imperceptibly, then everything was as usual, and at the same time, he said calmly, "I wish you an early summary of the logic behind AI's language." The unicorn head might have been just guessing, but the information it revealed couldn't help but stir up waves in Alexander's mind. During his walk in the spirit world, his soul got close to the deeper layer of this world. In the deeper places, you are more likely to see projections from misaligned time and space. Those projections could even show scenes from different timelines. Alexander didn't see any scenes from different timelines during his walk in the spirit world, but the unicorn head did get one thing right. AI, indeed, came from another time and space. So, was this pigeon brought to this world by a man named Zhou Ming from Earth, or was it really, as the unicorn had said, from a deeper layer of this world? The breakfast tasted like chewing wax, and the texture was even worse than wax. After finishing a less than satisfying meal, Alexander's mood didn't improve with his stomach filled. Instead, he felt slightly irritated because some information mentioned casually by the unicorn head triggered a bunch of messy speculations. He glanced at the pigeon, who was leisurely strolling on a nearby shelf, and felt his thoughts becoming more absurd. He had always thought that this pigeon, who spoke Earth language, was born because he had the soul of an Earthling. He believed that during his journey in the spirit world, the individual, Zhou Ming, reacted with the brass compass and thus gave birth to this strange bird. But what if It wasn't like this at all. What if, as the unicorn had said, this pigeon was just a kind of illusion that ran out from a deeper place and happened to condense its form beside him? Then the Earth language that I occasionally pops out has nothing to do with Zhoming's memory, but becomes a projection of a certain part of history recorded by this world itself. The possibilities behind this made Alexander feel restless. Isabella stood up, her voice interrupting Alexander's wild thoughts. Do you want me to wash the dishes? Alexander looked at the puppet lady in surprise, who scratched her hair awkwardly. I just thought that since I'm on board, I should find something to do, otherwise, I would appear as a freeloader. But you don't eat at all, Alexander reminded her. But it's good that you have this intention. Send the plates to the water room. If the sink doesn't mind, you can wash them. After saying this, he stood up without waiting for Isabella's response, walked towards the door of the captain's cabin and said casually, I'm going to patrol the deck, don't disturb me if there's nothing important. The pigeon, who had been strolling on the shelf, immediately flapped its wings and flew onto Alexander's shoulder, leaving the room with him, leaving Isabella and the unicorn head staring at each other. Is the captain in a bad mood? After hesitating for a moment, Isabella cautiously asked the unicorn head. The unicorn head replied in a deep tone, the captain's mood is like the weather of the boundless sea, don't speculate, just accept it. Not waiting for the unicorn head to continue, Isabella quickly asked, by the way, the captain just now said that I should negotiate with the sink, how do I do that? Simple, you wash things. If you get splashed with water, it means the sink doesn't like you. Speaking of which, do you know how to wash dishes? If not, I have some theoretical experience. Before the unicorn head finished speaking, Isabella quickly cleaned up the tableware on the table, and then ran towards the door while shouting, no need, I can learn, thank you, Mr. Unicorn Head, goodbye. The captain's room quieted down suddenly, leaving only the dark unicorn head on the table, staring at the direction where everyone had left with empty eyes. After a long time, a sigh came from the navigation table. How nice it would be if I had legs. Then its gaze returned to the sea chart. The mist around the wanderer was still dissipating slowly, and the task of steering the ship left by the captain had to be done well. Under precise control, this huge and living ghost ship sensitively adjusted the angles of its sails and continued to sail on this boundless sea. The unicorn head hummed an ancient sea song. The rough and hoarse humming echoed in the captain's cabin. Set sail, the sailor away from home continues forward. In the storm, in the noise, we are only a plank away from death. Reel in the jib, unfurl the main sail, let go of the ropes, hold on to the ship's side. We are already in the middle of the sea, stay away from the fish, stay away from the fish. Sailors want to cross the routes infested with offspring. Stay away from the fish, stay away from the fish. We want to land safely, liquor and furnace are just ahead. Alexander turned around in the warehouse where supplies were stored, then turned around in the kitchen, and finally returned to the deck in the middle section of the Wanderer. No matter how many times he searched, he couldn't find anything more appetizing than dried meat and cheese on this ship. The good news is that he doesn't have to eat maggot-infested biscuits like the sailors in the Age of Sail on Earth. The bad news is that there aren't even maggot-infested biscuits on this ship. He put aside those wild thoughts for a while. With the quiet eye, he came to the edge of the deck, looking at the boundless sea. He kept calculating in his heart. Anyway, I need to find a way to supplement the necessities of life on the Wanderer. Although I can't be too picky about the quality of life on a ghost ship, I can't really live like a ghost. Isabella might need a change of clothes, and there's no suitable dress for her on this ship. I must establish contact with the city-states on land as soon as possible. The Wanderer has been drifting at sea for too many years, and the city-states on land may have developed to an extent that even the unicorn head cannot predict during this period. From what I saw in that sewer, at least the Pran city-state is a strong and advanced city, and the revolvers carried by those cultists can also indicate the technological development of human society. The ancient ghost ship may not be so invincible in front of a civilized society that has developed for a century. The Wanderer still has its power, but it would be bad if only the power is left. Alexander looked at eye on his shoulder. Maybe, today I should rest and recuperate, and then try the next spiritual journey. Coo? I tilted his head, finally making some normal pigeon sounds. Alexander couldn't help laughing, but at this moment, he suddenly noticed a flash of light on the nearby sea surface out of the corner of his eye. He was attracted by the movement, subconsciously looked more towards the outside of the ship, and then noticed that there seemed to be something swimming under the nearby water surface. After hesitating for a moment, Alexander suddenly slapped himself on the forehead. Hey! My reaction, this is at sea. There are fish in the sea. The suddenly appeared possibility improved Alexander's mood. He realized that establishing contact with the land and providing a stable supply of supplies for the Wanderer was not something that could be done overnight. But couldn't this vast sea itself help? There are fish in the sea, and he has had enough of the dried meat and cheese on the ghost ship. Alexander's enthusiasm was ignited. He remembered that there was a heavy-duty fishing rod for sea fishing in a warehouse underneath the deck, and the position for fixing the fishing rod could also be found on the ship's side of the deck. As for the bait, I wonder if those dried meats and cheeses can work. So, while the cursed doll was washing dishes in the water room, the talking unicorn head was concentrating on driving the ship. The captain of the Wanderer was busy between the deck and the cabin. Alexander quickly found what he wanted. He carried 3 heavy-duty fishing rods and a pile of bait back to the deck, and then somewhat clumsily fixed these things on the edge of the ship. After baiting and casting, he moved a bucket from nearby to serve as a chair while waiting. Alexander actually had no experience in sea fishing. All his fishing experience was limited to ponds and a small river near his old home. He didn't know if his whim could really catch fish, but anyway, he was idle. What if, just consider it as a rest before the next spiritual journey, and also reserve some expectations for the future meals. Alexander sat down among the fishing rods, and his mood gradually calmed down in the long wait. Today's sea conditions are still stable. There are some clouds in the sky, but there are no signs of a storm. Alexander sat on the bucket, leaning against a winch used to fix the rope, and squinted. Slightly in the slight sway of the ship. He didn't know when, he fell into a half-dream half-awake state. He dreamed that he was walking barefoot on the calm sea. The sea was blue, and the sun was warm. The familiar and normal sun from his memory hung high in the sky, bright but not scorching. He heard the sound of splashing water, and when he looked in the direction of the sound, he saw fish suddenly jumping out of the calm water nearby. It was a group of golden fish. They seemed to be only the size of a palm. They were blowing bubbles in the air, waving their tails, just like swimming in water, slowly circling around Alexander. These fish swimming in the air gradually approached. Zhoming curiously watched them, their round eyes, their delicate scales, their opening and closing mouths, and the fine lines like water waves drifting behind them. Zhoming suddenly thought these fish were beautiful, and they smelled good, must be very, very good. Translate the above novel into English. The language should be fluent and conform to the reading habits of English native speakers. The sudden sound of waves jolted Alexander from his dream. He opened his eyes sharply. The images he had seen in the half-awake, half-asleep state had already faded into thin silhouettes. He only remembered seeing fish swimming in the air, and the fish circling him seemed particularly delicious. But what did those fish look like? Fish, can they swim in the air? Alexander blinked. A strange feeling of reality and dreams tearing and blending made him a little confused for a while. He looked at his 3 fishing rods fixed on the fishing rod rack, but did not see any signs of fish being hooked. The sea in the distance had begun to surge, wave after wave hitting the hull of the Wanderer. Then, the waves grew bigger, visibly stronger. Wave after wave continuously came from the distance. The huge body of the Wanderer swayed in the wind and waves, and the sound of the surging waves filled the ears. Alexander looked up at the sky and found that the weather was still good. It seemed to be just a little more windy, but it should not cause any extreme weather like a big storm. This might not be a good day for fishing, he muttered, considering whether to pack up his fishing rods. But at that moment, he suddenly noticed from the corner of his eye that one of the fishing rods had bent sharply. The strong fishing line prepared for sea fishing instantly tightened, and the short, stout and sturdy sea fishing rod seemed to have caught something big. The whole front half was bent like a bow, accompanied by a harsh squeaking sound. The fishing rod rack used to secure the fishing rod also made a wooden friction sound under this huge pull. All these gave Alexander a signal: fish is here. A big one. He immediately dismissed the idea of resting, the enthusiasm of the fisherman burning in his chest. He reached the outgoing fishing rod in 2 steps, holding the fishing rod with one hand to prevent it from falling off the fishing rod rack, and started to adjust the tightness of the fishing line a little bit with the other hand. I knew it. I couldn't possibly fail. Alexander excitedly talked to himself, starting a struggle with the huge creature at the other end of the fishing line. This was a tough fight. The thing at the end of the fishing line obviously did not intend to give up easily. A huge force was pulling the fishing rod. Even with Alexander's strength and the support of the fishing rod rack, this stalemate still seemed precarious. The wind and waves around the Wanderer grew a little bit bigger, but for Alexander, this little shaking was nothing. That he was just annoyed by the stubborn prey, and worried about the opportunity to improve the diet that had finally come to him. The tension of the fishing line had reached the critical point, and the big fish was about to break free from him after an unknown stalemate. Alexander finally made up his mind. A cluster of dark green flames suddenly spread from his hand holding the fishing rod. The green fire blazed, spreading like water, and quickly flowed along the fishing rod and fishing line. The fire of the spirit body burned all the way, forming a fire line that went straight into the sea along the fishing line. The next second, a huge shadow appeared in the deep sea around the Wanderer under the projection and outline of the dark green flames. The shadow was like an uncertain meatball, almost covering all the sea surface within hundreds of meters around the Wanderer. Its edges extended a large number of constantly changing, constantly germinating dark things, like hundreds of arms moving and waving in the ocean, stirring the sea around the Wanderer, controlling the invisible waves to surge and roll. Alexander heard some strange noises from the sea. He maintained the stalemate with the prey, while curiously looking out. He saw nothing, just the rising and falling of the waves, which did not change much from before, and he clearly felt that the opposing force transmitted from the fishing rod was a little weaker than before. The prey was beginning to lose strength, and this fact brought a bright smile to his face. He began to tighten the fishing line. Little by little pulling his prey out of the sea, Isabella was startled by the roar and howl. Coming from outside the cabin, the shaking came from under her feet, causing the furnishings in the cabin to make a series of clinking noises. She quickly grabbed a nearby railing, preventing herself from falling, her face showing a puzzled expression. What's happening? The wanderer was shaking, as if a huge storm was raging outside, and some kind of deep, oppressive strange sound was also coming from the depths of this ancient ghost ship, as if it was roaring, howling, fighting against the terror brought by the deep sea, against a huge beast that was trying to devour itself. Various things in the cabin were making noises. At first Isabella thought these were collisions caused by the ship shaking, but soon she found that many of these noisy things were actually making noise in place. They were making noises to communicate with each other, but Isabella couldn't understand this language that only the wanderer itself could understand. She knew something might have gone wrong outside. The puppet miss decided to go to the deck. She stumbled out of the cabin, running towards the deck while leaning on the nearby walls to avoid falling. After narrowly avoiding being tripped by the flying ropes and the barrels rushing around, she finally arrived at the end of the staircase and pushed open the constantly swaying wooden door in the waves, only to see the boundless sea stirring up astounding huge waves. The sky was as black as ink. The ominous thick clouds were almost congealed into heavy lumps. The clouds were pressing close to the sea surface, while the wall-like waves were surging and rolling under the dark clouds, rising and falling like a siege around the lost wanderer. Isabella was seeing this kind of scene for the first time. She didn't know if this was normal at sea, but she knew she had to find the captain at this time. She looked around on the deck and found Captain Alexander standing on the edge of the deck without much effort. The surrounding waves were a bit annoying, but for Alexander, who was about to succeed, this was just some insignificant disturbance. Under the dual feedback of the fishing line and the green fire, he could clearly feel that his prey had stopped resisting and that the huge creature was being slowly pulled out of the water by him. "Come on up, you!" he shouted happily, pulling hard on his fishing rod one last time. A big fish jumped out of the sea. It was really big, almost half his size. In that brief instant, Alexander locked eyes with the fish suspended in midair. Quite ugly. That was his first impression. Indeed, it was a very ugly fish, its black body covered with a rough, uneven surface like some kind of growth, and strange gray-white patterns running randomly along its fins. You could see many bone-like structures on the fish's head, and a pair of hollow, pale eyes were staring at Alexander from beneath those bone spikes. Alexander felt uncomfortable, as if the fish was looking at him maliciously, but the next second, he saw the fish convulse violently, and its eyes, which had been staring at him, suddenly burst open, gushing blood instantly. The fish fell heavily onto the deck, twitching and jumping like it had been electrocuted, and quickly quieted down after just a few seconds. Blood seeped from its mouth and burst eyes, dripping onto the deck. Alexander looked at this incredibly ugly fish losing its life quickly at his feet, and vaguely remembered something he had read in a book. Most fish in the deep sea are indeed very ugly, and because they live under water pressure for a long time, they do often burst their blood vessels and die quickly from the change in pressure when they are fished out of the water. Is that the case with the fish in this world too? Just as he was lost in thought, a crackling sound suddenly came over. Curiously turning to the sound, Alexander saw several more strange fish, smaller in size, falling onto the deck. They looked similar to the half-human-sized fish but were only about half a meter long, and just like the big fish, by the time Alexander noticed them, they were already bleeding heavily and were soon on their last breaths. Alexander was taken aback, and after a while, he reacted, like Gord saving Grandpa. One after the other. Alice clung tightly to the railing next to her, anxiously watching the brutal fight that would drive ordinary people mad. Not far away, she saw Captain Alexander standing on the edge of the deck, with a green fire burning fiercely on him, standing against the sea like a giant in flames. 3 hook chains extended from the deck under his feet, one of which was burning with a terrifying flame. She saw a huge shadow appear in the boundless sea, and then a tentacle almost thicker than the main mast of the lost wanderer stretched out from the sea. The tentacle had countless malicious eyes on its surface, and countless sharp teeth were grinding and chewing between the eyes, as if they were going to bite the whole ship into pieces at the next moment. Isabella almost cried out in surprise. She wanted to warn the captain to dodge, wanted to rush up to help, but before she could act, the tentacle smashed down at the captain. She saw Captain Alexander raise his head, and under the burning flames, there was a joy of harvest on the captain's face. He was looking at the countless eyes on the tentacle, and the countless eyes on the tentacle were also looking at him. The next second, all the eyes on the tentacle burst open. Hundreds of sharp teeth made a piercing and painful scream, and then, the tentacle broke off in the air, as if the huge body hidden under the sea surface had actively cut off the connection with the tentacle, leaving the severely injured end of the tentacle on the deck. The tentacle fell to the ground with a thud, and the dirty, sticky blood and flesh that fell from the broken end also splattered on the ground, falling at the captain's feet. The sea has finally calmed down. Isabella saw the tentacle that fell on the deck, and some kind of flesh and blood fragments containing powerful force also fell at the captain's feet. The vitality quickly disappeared from these flesh and blood. At the same moment, the huge creature lurking under the sea around the wanderer began to accelerate and dive. After paying a tentacle as a price, it quickly left the sea area where the wanderer was located, and it even seemed to be fleeing in a hurry. During the process of this huge shadow returning to the deep sea, the sea recovered its calmness at an astonishing speed, and the clouds in the sky that were as deep as ink also completely dissipated. Perhaps those were not clouds at all. Isabella looked up at the sky. She still remembered the appearance of the clouds before, she recalled the outline of the clouds when they dissipated, and finally vaguely corresponded it to the shadow under the water around the ship before. The heavy clouds in the sky seemed to be a shadow cast by a huge creature in the sea on the sky. The sound of the fire burning came from the edge of the deck, interrupting Isabella's thoughts. She hurriedly looked in the direction of the captain, but saw that the captain had returned to his usual appearance. This tall man had a happy smile on his face, and he had already noticed Isabella standing not far away, so he waved his hand to signal the doll lady to come over. Seeing Isabella walking in front of him, Alexander kicked the big fish on the deck, his tone slightly raised. "Look, I caught a big fish." "Big fish?" Isabella's expression was a bit dull. She looked at the thing next to Alexander's foot. Among the twisted and rolling flesh and blood, countless eyes with flesh and blood bursting were still half opening and half closing. Watching the sky, the sharp teeth are shining with metallic luster between the eyeballs. With Alexander's kick, half of the eyes on this broken tentacle suddenly blinked, but then they all closed. "Yeah, big fish," Alexander said happily. "Look, it took me a lot of effort to get this thing up." Although she is just a doll, Isabella still felt as if her muscles twitched at the corners of her eyes at this moment. She opened her mouth to speak, but she didn't know where to start to correct this topic. She looked at the fish next to Alexander. A big ugly fish lay there, black and rough skin, strange gray-white patterns near the fins, bone spurs extending from the head, a pair of dead fish eyes staring at her. There are also many small fish scattered on the deck around. Isabella suddenly lost all her expressions and words. She stared at the scene in front of her, looked at the fish lying on the deck, and looked at these things that were not fish. A second ago, the lack of life experience of the doll lady does not yet understand what it means to doubt life, but at this moment, she really suddenly doubted everything. She even doubted whether she was dreaming. Where did the tentacles and those flesh and blood go? Perhaps her momentary daze was too obvious. Alexander immediately noticed Isabella's abnormality. He picked his eyebrows and looked at the doll. "What's wrong? Is there something wrong?" Isabella opened her mouth, but just as she was about to say something to correct something, the rules that the unicorn had told her before suddenly appeared in her mind. On the Wanderer, Captain Alexander is the absolute authority, and his words are the absolute facts. If the real world contradicts Captain Alexander's words, then the captain's judgment shall prevail. There is no problem at all. Isabella suddenly reacted and quickly said, and then as if to cover up the overly nervous part of her tone, she quickly changed the topic. "By the way, Captain, the storm just now was really scary." "Storm? You mean that wave?" Alexander looked at the doll lady in doubt. "That wave is indeed not small, but it is far from a storm." "But it is also true. You haven't seen any real storms." "Isabella, you are right." Captain Alexander called the storm that almost covered the entire sea area a wave, so it was a wave. Captain Alexander thought that the things he caught on the ship were fish, so these things were fish. "I feel you are a bit nervous. Are you really okay?" Alexander still noticed something wrong with Isabella's tone. He looked at his #1 crew member with some concern. "Could it be seasick? Will you get seasick?" "I'm fine, just the boat was shaking badly just now." Isabella looked at the captain in front of her who showed concern, but she didn't know whether to feel at ease or to feel more fear, so she could only change the topic awkwardly. "By the way, what are you going to do with these fish you caught?" "What else? Of course it's for eating." Alexander laughed. Isabella's expression was stunned for a moment. "Eat? What else? Haven't you noticed that the food reserve on the Wanderer is too monotonous?" Alexander's mood was obviously very good. "I plan to dismantle this big one, stew some and roast some. These slightly smaller ones are salted and made into dried fish." He happily talked about his plans for the next step, but although he was very confident in his mouth, he was not sure whether he could succeed. His cooking skills were just mediocre, and he had no experience in dealing with such huge sea fish. And the method of making dried fish only has a little theoretical knowledge and there is no practical experience at all. But how do you know if you don't try? The only problem is not to get a bad stomach. Alexander still retained some sanity in the joy of the big harvest. He cautiously looked at the big fish at his feet, guessing whether this gift from nature would be poisonous. The most prudent way is to find a scapegoat to taste it first. He first thought of the unicorn head in the captain's room, and then immediately ruled out this option, and then looked at the cursed doll opposite. This doll won't work either. Isabella has no stomach at all. Finally, he looked at the pigeon on his shoulder. The pigeon also looked at him with his head tilted. Although AI doesn't look like a normal creature, if you have to find a living thing with flesh and blood on the ship, it seems that only this pigeon is left. A moment later, Alexander took his harvest and left the deck. Lunchtime was approaching, and he couldn't wait to improve the food on the Wanderer. Isabella stayed in place for a while, and then came to the door of the captain's room. She didn't intend to find the unicorn head. Since she had seen the first officer nagging last time, She even had a deep awe of the entire captain's room. That if possible, she doesn't want to take the initiative to step into the door of the captain's room, but what happened today is really weird. She feels it is necessary to consult with the experienced Mr. Unicorn Head to see if this is a normal phenomenon on the Wanderer. She didn't violate the crew rules. She just inquired about the situation. It should not be taboo. After hesitating for a full 10 seconds, Isabella finally plucked up the courage and opened the door of the captain's room. The next second, she was startled to see that the Unicorn Head had already turned towards the door, staring at her dead. It seemed to have been waiting for her to come. What happened outside? The Unicorn Head asked succinctly, which was extremely rare. Isabella sensed something wrong from the other party's abnormal performance. She hurriedly turned around and closed the door, came to the navigation table, and told the other party everything she saw, and after her voice fell, the Unicorn Head fell into an extremely abnormal silence during a full minute. It did not say a word. The wooden carved sheep's head cannot make expressions, but Isabella could clearly feel. It seemed that things were a bit beyond this first officer's judgment. Isabella suddenly became nervous. She unconsciously leaned forward. Could it be that this is not a normal occurrence on the Wanderer? Could the captain really? Everything on the Wanderer is normal. The Unicorn Head finally woke up from the silence. It quickly replied, as if to plug some kind of loophole as soon as possible to interrupt Isabella's words. Listen, everything on the Wanderer is normal, always normal. Great Captain Alexander is as always. But, I just watched your reaction. The situation is a bit beyond my expectations, but this is due to my lack of imagination and cognition. The Unicorn Head's words quickly became fluent. It seemed to be gradually returning to its usual state, and then, its mood obviously began to rise. Even the tone has also become impassioned. Yes, the great Captain Alexander, he should be greater and stronger. There is nothing abnormal, Miss Isabella. Listen, everything is normal on the Wanderer. Let the captain do what he thinks is right. Don't continue to discuss this topic. You just need to remember this fact from today: there are fish in the kitchen of the Wanderer, and fish are delicious ingredients. Preparing such a gigantic fish for lunch was by no means an easy task. It was not only a matter of skill but also a test of physical strength. Fortunately, Alexander, driven by his sense of duty as a fisherman and his passion for improving the diet, was able to tackle the large fish he had caught that day with full force. He spent a long time in the kitchen, successfully removing the bony spines from the ugly fish's head, and clumsily divided its plump body into several pieces. The fish's head had little meat and was temporarily discarded, but the belly and back of the fish had some parts with excellent meat quality, making them suitable ingredients for the lost traveler. It seemed a bit strange for the captain to be busy in the kitchen, but Alexander enjoyed it. He wondered how ordinary people, who feared the lost traveler like a plague, would react if they saw this. Would they be astonished to see such a mundane side of the fearsome ghost captain, or would they first admire Alexander's excellent fishing skills? While dividing the fish into pieces, Alexander suddenly thought of this question. In a good mood, he couldn't help but laugh, thinking that maybe one day he would invite some people to visit the ship in a friendly manner. The lost traveler wouldn't always be synonymous with disaster, and he himself didn't intend to be a cold-hearted ghost captain forever. After further understanding of the world, he naturally wanted to integrate with contemporary civilization. When that time comes, he would serve fish to the guests on the ship. After the simple division, Alexander temporarily put most of the fish meat into a wooden barrel lined with sea salt and pushed the heavy barrel into the warehouse deep in the kitchen. The remaining smaller fish were to be processed later. He planned to marinate them and dry them on the deck. If everything went well, they would become salted fish in the sea breeze. It was a pity that he couldn't find any strong liquor on the ship, otherwise he would have more ways to process the fish. Having fresh fish to eat every day was a good thing, but Alexander knew that fishing was always a matter of chance. He had a good catch today, but it might not always be the case in the future. He had to consider how to preserve the excess food. After all, although the dried meat and cheese stored on the lost traveler showed no signs of spoilage, he couldn't be sure whether this was a special feature of the lost traveler or whether there was something abnormal about the dried meat and cheese. It wouldn't be good if the fish he had caught with great difficulty went bad. Salted fish was at least better than salted meat from a century ago, even if it was just for a change of taste. Alexander left the most tender and best-looking parts of the fish, and threw them into the pot with the dried meat. The dried meat acted as a seasoning in this process. This was a wasteful practice. Any real chef would have their blood pressure skyrocket at the sight of Alexander's operation. The most suitable way to cook these tender fish would be to make sashimi, followed by moderate grilling. Alexander knew this, but he did it for safety's sake. He didn't dare to eat something unfamiliar from the sea raw. Although theoretically sea fish wouldn't carry parasites harmful to the human body, and as a ghost captain, he probably wouldn't be afraid of ordinary poisons, what if, in contrast, stewing was the most effective way to process unfamiliar ingredients? He wanted to try it first. If he confirmed that the fish was edible, he would consider other cooking methods. By the time it was almost mid-afternoon, his late lunch was finally ready. A bowl of fish soup was brought up, and the delicious taste made Alexander's appetite soar. But before that, he cautiously forked a piece of fish, cooled it down, and placed it in front of his pigeon. Pigeons, of course, don't eat meat, but it's hard to say whether AI is a normal pigeon. Alexander needed to satisfy his curiosity. On the Lost Traveler, he had too many things to try.as for what to do if the abnormal pigeon really gets poisoned after eating the fish. Alexander was prepared. First of all, he had processed the food as much as possible, and letting the pigeon try it was just a formality. Secondly, if AI's condition was really wrong, he could immediately pull it into a spiritual state with green fire. He had tried before, and in AI's spiritual state, it was like a item controlled by the spirit fire, just like the feedback from the brass compass. He could even disassemble and reassemble the spirit AI and teleport it to a designated position next to him. In this case, ordinary toxins would definitely not work. AI tilted his head and looked at Alexander's operation. After confirming that the piece of fish was for him, he first pecked at the table next to him with his beak, his eyes flitting between Alexander and the ceiling. Is this melon ripe? Alexander, just say if you're going to eat it or not. AI flapped his wings, imitating Alexander's tone. Just say if you're going to eat it or not. Then it lowered its head and pecked at the cooled fish at a surprising speed. In a few bites, it had finished eating what didn't look like food for a pigeon at all. After eating, AI stretched its neck vigorously, then strutted around the table. It seemed very happy, and after a round, it returned to Alexander and squawked loudly, "Delicious! Delicious!" Alexander watched the pigeon in astonishment, and a thought suddenly popped into his head. This thing is now a combination of pigeon, delicious, and echo machine. With these three elements, it's almost a beacon of humanity. According to the Freeform 9 grid, it can also be considered a human. After a while, Alexander confirmed that the pigeon showed no abnormal reactions, and finally relaxed. The captain of the Lost Traveler and his pet were thus hiding in the kitchen, feasting on food. The fish was indeed delicious, just as Alexander had seen in his dream. The setting sun was gradually approaching the high walls on the edge of the city. The tall chimneys, pipes, and towers of the city-state of Prand were slowly bathed in a pale golden light that in the city center. The loud ringing of the bell and the sharp whistle of the steam venting from the pressure valve echoed from the high ground where the Storm Cathedral was located. A large cloud of white mist erupted from the top of the tower on the side of the cathedral, covering the sky above the high ground like clouds and reflecting the golden sunlight from the sea. This was a signal representing the transition from day to night, a reminder that the power of the sun was about to fade rapidly and that the creator of the world was about to dominate the sky in the night. The order of the world would shift from stability to upheaval, and the influence from the deep of the world would intensify with the arrival of nightfall, a process that would continue until the sun rose the next day. In the night, cautious people would choose to stay at home, and those who had to go out would try to stay in brightly lit places as much as possible. Gas lamps blessed by the clergy could dispel the malice of the night to the greatest extent, but no matter what, this was at least a prosperous and stable city-state. Under the protection of the Holy Storm Cathedral, even the deepest influence of the world would be suppressed below the safe threshold. The occasional anomalies in the city were minor issues that did no harm, and ordinary citizens knew how to ensure the safety of their homes. There were also the church's guardians who took over the duties of the law enforcement officers at night, ensuring the order of the city after nightfall. But just like how there are always shadows under the brightest streetlights, even under the watchful eyes of the church's guardians, there are always fools who yearn for darkness and subversion. They fear and despise the existing order of the world, and in their fanaticism, they look forward to a better era that even they have never seen. Fortunately, in a city where order is dominant, these subversives can only cower in the shadows most of the time. On the edge of the city-state, in the depths of an abandoned sewer entrance, a few figures in black robes are huddled in the corner of a room. This used to be a temporary rest room for sewer maintenance personnel, but now it has been forgotten as the city's planning has changed. The neglected corner has become a haven for the fleeing cultists. A dimly lit oil lamp hangs on the wall, illuminating a few faces filled with gloom, fear, and a mix of anger. A man in his 30s in a black robe was lying on a makeshift bed of rags, teeth clenched, face pale, and breathing weak and erratic, while the others sat nearby. One of them muttered in a low voice, "Those damn church dogs, we've lost many of our brethren, and the messenger died in the ritual." Another said hoarsely, "How could the sacred ritual suddenly lose control? That sacrifice, it's clearly because of that sacrifice. He's clearly a pawn of the heretics. Listen." A black-robed man suddenly made a gesture of listening, and pointed upwards. "It's the sound of the evening bell and the steam whistle." "It's about to be night," the first one to curse said in a low voice, looking uneasily at the brother, who was lying on the bed in a clearly terrible state. "Damn. I hope he can survive the night." The tolling of the evening bell and the sound of a steam whistle, the heralds of day turning into night, echoed faintly through the damp, dark tunnels and shafts of the underground sewer. This signal of the approaching nightfall only deepened the gloom of the cultists hiding in the abandoned rest area. Among them, one had fallen seriously ill, a disease of unknown origin, and now he was on the brink of death in this dimly lit underworld. "He's still alive," hesitated one of the cultists, glancing at his brother lying on the ground. Seeing that the latter's eyes were half open, with his eyeballs slowly rotating in their sockets, he knew that the unfortunate man could still hear the surrounding sounds, but he no longer had the strength to fully open his eyes. "He's alive now, yes," another cultist said in a low voice. "The evening bell has already tolled." He can't die in this room, the Lord's protection will bless him with a peaceful sleep in the darkness. The man lying on the ground twitched his fingers. He clearly understood his predicament. He didn't want to die like this, but death had already tightly gripped his shadow, and from the looks of it, his beloved son brethren were considering moving this risk out of the shelter before true death arrived. A heavy silence filled the room, making the dying man's weak breathing sound distinctly audible. After a long silence, the man in the black robe who had previously cursed the storm church finally broke the silence. Let's wait a little longer. At least, a person doesn't immediately change when they draw their last breath. Then we'll wait, the low-voiced black-robed cultist relented. He glanced at the man who was struggling to breathe, and couldn't help but mutter, but why did he suddenly fall ill? Are you sure this is just a normal illness? I know him, he ran a near-bankrupt antique store in the lower city, full of fakes, spoke a cultist who had been mostly silent until now. He's always been sick, his health has never been good. Probably due to spending too long in the sewer and being scared before, his condition worsened. Hearing the explanation from the person next to him, the low-voiced black-robed cultist finally relaxed somewhat. Although not a high-ranking priest, he had been a follower of the sun for many years and had gained a fair amount of knowledge about occult studies. He knew all too well the long-term and hidden dangers that could remain after a failed sacrificial ritual, and that every believer who participated in the ritual might become a carrier of these hidden dangers. Now, this man who had suddenly fallen into extreme weakness might just be such a carrier. If it wasn't for the restraint of all of the sun's children are brethren, and that there were a few cultists around him who couldn't bear to do it, he would have thrown this unfortunate man into the vast darkness outside long ago. After a long silence, the black-robed cultist suddenly made a move. He took out a pale gold amulet from his chest and stuffed it into the chest of the dying brother. What are you doing? A cultist next to him asked curiously. This sacred amulet is something I exchanged from the messenger at a great cost, he said solemnly, his tone sincere. May the grace of the Lord protect our brother. Perhaps the light of the sun can protect him from further erosion in the darkness. The two cultists next to him didn't doubt him, and looked at the church elder who had given out the amulet with admiration. They clenched their fists and placed them on their foreheads, quietly reciting in devotion, all of the sun's children are brethren. The low-voiced black-robed man also clenched his fist and placed it on his forehead, quietly reciting along, all of the sun's children are brethren. After the sun had completely set below the horizon, the starless and moonless sky appeared before Alexander once again. A pale scar stretched across the sky, illuminating the boundless sea with cold light, and the wanderer, sailing on the sea. Alexander stood near the stern deck, withdrew his gaze from the sky, and sighed softly. No matter how many times he looked, he would never see any stars in the cold, pale light that didn't exist. But compared to the last time he saw this starless night, his mood was much better now. On the one hand, he had accepted the strange aspects of this world and was actively adapting to his current life. On the other hand, the fish today was indeed good. He was an optimistic person, and any small improvement in life was worth being happy about for him, especially since the gifts from nature were more than he had expected. At this rate, even if he couldn't establish a stable contact with the land in a short time, he could at least improve the living conditions on this ship. Lost in thought, he turned to look at the pigeon standing on his shoulder, and casually joked, "What do you think? Would it be simpler for me to do something a pirate captain should do? Like finding a busy route to rob and plunder?" The pigeon tilted its head, its eyes seemingly looking in different directions. "Does it sound right? Does it sound right? Does it sound right? That's true, it's not my style," Alexander laughed, "and it's easier said than done. Robbing and plundering would at least require finding a shipping route with merchant ships." This vast sea was empty, and the wanderer didn't know how far it had drifted from civilization. Since the last collision with the ship transporting the abnormal 099, he hadn't seen any other ships appear in sight. He really didn't know where to find victims even if he wanted to rob. But just then, a voice suddenly came from the side, interrupting Alexander's daydreaming. "Captain, are we going to rob?" Alexander looked in the direction of the voice and saw Isabella sitting on a high wooden board nearby, curiously looking at him under the illumination of the pale scar in the sky. The Gothic doll in a court dress sat high on the ghost ship, her mercury-like long hair shimmering with a cold glow in the night. She sat gracefully, her eyes full of curiosity. This scene was like a classical and mysterious painting. Alexander was momentarily surprised. After experiencing several chaotic real-life trivialities, he had almost forgotten the elegant and mysterious impression that this doll lady had initially given him when she was lying in the wooden box. As a result, seeing Isabella in a calm state now, he was somewhat taken aback. Isabella didn't know what the captain was thinking. She just curiously asked again, "Captain, are we going to rob?" This sentence was a bit of a blow to her image. Alexander looked at the doll helplessly. "Do you like robbing?" "No," Isabella shook her head, "sounds boring." "But you were robbed onto the ship by me," Alexander reminded her with a smile. "That's true," Isabella thought for a moment and nodded, then asked again, "So are we going to rob now?" "No," Alexander waved his hand, walking leisurely towards his captain's cabin. "I also think robbing is boring. Compared to that, taking a walk is more suitable as a post-meal exercise." Alexander returned to the captain's cabin. After briefly instructing the unicorn head to steer, he entered his bedroom and closed the door, just like last time that he had decided to undertake his second spirit walk tonight. But unlike last time, this time he wanted to test this ability through AI. The pigeon. A cluster of faint green sparks danced at Alexander's fingertips, and in the blink of an eye, the pigeon that had been wandering on the table disappeared and reappeared on his shoulder. Feeling the vague connection between AI and himself, Alexander slowly calmed down. Then he recalled that feeling when he had activated the brass compass last time, and started to try to communicate with AI using the spirit fire in his hand. The invisible green flame turned into a thin line, winding around AI's wings. The next second, the pigeon was suddenly enveloped in flames. In the burning fire, the pigeon's feathers all turned into an ethereal form. The rising green fire seemed to reshape its flesh and bones. AI raised its wings in the fire, and the brass compass hanging on its chest snapped open. The dial, filled with many occult symbols, flickered with a faint light, and the pointer in the center pointed straight ahead. After spinning wildly, the surrounding scene crumbled, and the familiar dark space appeared in front of Alexander, followed by those familiar streams of light and countless tiny lights. Alexander followed his heart and looked at those stars, looking for the next target to contact. Suddenly, he was attracted by a cluster of stars. He didn't know if this was the intuition of Captain Alexander that the unicorn had always talked about, but he decided to follow this feeling. No matter who was behind that starlight, now, they were destined with Captain Alexander. In the abandoned sewer on the edge of the Pran City state, the few sun god cultists who had managed to escape from the church guards were silently waiting. The world above had plunged into deep night, while the underworld was only protected by a faint light in the abandoned room. Even the most cruel and inhuman cultists would feel nervous and terrified in the face of the gradually approaching darkness. Beside them, on the ragged mattress, the dying man was about to draw his last breath. Listening to the increasingly deep and difficult breathing, several pairs of eyes turned to the dying man. They stared hard at the brother on the mattress, each of them very clear that this man was indeed not going to make it through the night. And so, under the scrutiny of several pairs of eyes, the man on the mattress took his last breath. "May the sun continue to shine on your soul in the darkness," said the low-voiced black-robed cultist slowly, and then waved his hand. "Take him." The next second, his words were suddenly cut off. In front of him, the corpse with its eyes tightly closed began to breathe again. The corpse was breathing, as if it had wandered on the edge of the realm of death, and returned to the world of the living. The black-robed cultists in the room stared blankly at this scene. Some of them didn't even realize that the man in front of them had just died once, because the transition from life to death was so brief that unless you were paying close attention, you wouldn't be able to tell. They just felt that the dying comrade in front of them had suddenly stabilized and strengthened his breath, which was rather surprising. The next second, the man lying on the ground opened his eyes. He seemed to have been in the dark for too long, so much so that even the dim oil lamp in the room made him feel dazzled. He blinked to adjust to the light, then slowly turned his eyes, as if he had just noticed the three black-robed men around him. "Thanks be to the Lord." A relatively young black-robed cultist finally reacted, exclaiming excitedly, "You made it. I thought you were going to, wait. No. Back off." The man with the deep voice suddenly realized something. He stopped the others and stared at the newly awakened man with a wary look. As he retreated, he threatened, his breath had completely stopped just now. "I'm absolutely sure, something's not right." Alexander finally adapted to his surroundings, and the ringing noise in his brain gradually faded away. He saw the figures around him, and his first reaction was, "Why are these people still here when I open my eyes? Why am I still in the sewer?" The walk in the spirit world should be random, and when he chose the target, he was just following his intuition. But he didn't expect that both times he opened his eyes, he landed in the midst of these cultists. What kind of fate is this? But then, he noticed something wrong from the reactions of the people around him. The next second, he noticed the black robe on his body. Alexander was silent for 2 seconds, and then he understood that in the last round, he was the sacrifice offered by the cultists, and then with the blink of an eye, now he was a cultist. He really had a fate with these people. Something's not right. Just then, a hostile, deep voice suddenly interrupted Alexander's confused state after waking up. He looked in the direction of the sound and immediately met a cold, wary gaze. The owner of that gaze was staring at him coldly, and on the side, the other two black-robed men also reacted, retreating and taking a defensive stance. Alexander was stunned for a moment, suddenly realizing, he might have, like last time, possessed a corpse that he was playing dead in front of these cultists. After understanding the situation, the nervous reactions of these cultists became logical. Alexander's mind raced, feeling the lingering numbness and sluggishness in this body that had not yet completely dissipated. It seemed difficult to do anything under the eyes of several cultists. He could only try to stabilize these people first, but as he was quickly thinking of a way out, fragments of disjointed, fuzzy memories suddenly appeared in his mind. In those disjointed, fuzzy memories, he suddenly remembered many experiences that were not his own. He remembered himself hiding in the sewer, remembered himself offering his home's money to the messenger of the sun, remembered himself, participating in those dark, crazy, and bloody sinful rituals to heal diseases. Drinking the blood of innocent people in exchange for the blessing of the sun, at the end of a series of chaotic memories, he saw the scene of the sacrifice ceremony, saw many people like himself in black robes standing next to the stage, and a young sacrifice being pushed onto the stage. The young sacrifice had a stiff and strange expression that plunged the whole ceremony into chaos. He saw that a messenger of the sun being sacrificed a heart, all the people around the altar fell into madness, the cultists were killing each other, surging flames flowed from the sun totem, angry roars and void murmurs filled the assembly, and the original owner of his body and the last few remaining cultists fled in panic. Alexander didn't know how long he had been in a daze, or perhaps it was only a moment. The turbulent, unfamiliar memories in his mind had calmed down again. A sad and hateful life had become a series of pale fragments, lying at the bottom of his heart like some kind of nutrient, as if for viewing. These were the memories of the original owner of this body. Although there weren't many, there was no doubt about their origin. Alexander blinked. This was a change that had not occurred during his last walk in the spirit world. Last time, he didn't get any memories from the body he possessed. The brain of that sacrifice was blank. Why was there a change this time? Was it because the body he occupied this time was still fresh? Or because the pigeon strengthened the power of the brass compass? Alexander slowly sat up from the ground. He knew that no matter what the reason for this change was, now was not a good time to be in a daze. Those tense cultists had obviously realized that something was wrong with his resurrection process, and as Alexander stood up, the three cultists also retreated half a step. Then the man with the deep voice broke the silence. "Don't move, tell me, what's your name?" "Ron," Alexander recalled briefly, then naturally said the name he had just learned from his memory, Ron Strain. "He is called Ron." A young black-robed cultist immediately whispered to the man with the deep voice who had become the leader of the three. However, the man in the black robe did not relax his vigilance at all. He continued to stare at Alexander, then suddenly recited in a strange syllable rhythm, "In the name of the sun, may the Lord's glory shine upon us, in the name of the sun, may the Lord's blessing descend." Hearing the sudden frenzy of the cultist opposite, Alexander was stunned for a moment, then felt a burning sensation in his chest. He instinctively reached out and pulled out the thing that was heating up under his clothes, only to see that it was a golden sun amulet. A strange heat was coming from the surface of the amulet. The next second, the amulet suddenly burst into flames. The flames seemed to be full of malice, rushing straight to Alexander's heart. The glory of the Lord is backfiring on him. Seeing this, the cultist who had just recited the prayer reacted instantly. He drew his short sword and shouted, "His soul has been replaced. Kill this heretic filth." The reactions of the other two cultists were obviously slower, but then they also reacted. These people who had just thought Alexander was a comrade unhesitatingly drew their short swords and daggers, shouting with murderous intent as they pounced, "Kill him." Alexander held the sun amulet that was still burning in his hand, watching as three figures pounced at him. The next second, another shadow suddenly appeared in the corner of his vision, a spectral bird, its body ablaze with ghostly green flames, tore through the air. It circled the ceiling, scattering invisible ashes and feather fragments with each flap of its wings. The three cultists were naturally drawn to this spectral bird. They instinctively looked up at AI in its spectral form. The next moment, their actions slowed down. It was as if their connection with the real world had suddenly become distant and slow. The figures of the three black-robed men flickered in midair like frame-by-frame animation, creating overlapping afterimages. They landed on the ground in slow, ridiculous movements, and finally froze completely less than 2 meters in front of Alexander. Their eyes were filled with immense shock as they watched the spectral bird circle the ceiling once before landing on the black-robed comrade across from them. They saw the sun amulet in the man's hand still burning, but the next second, the burning flames turned into a ghostly green, the same form as the flames on the spectral bird. Alexander pinched the sun amulet that had been completely occupied and transformed, and the green flames of the spirit body wound around the surface of the amulet. The flame flow gushing from the amulet circled in front of him and then, like a well-behaved pet, settled down, winding slowly around his arm. He held the completely occupied and transformed sun amulet and calmly approached the three cultists. He looked into their shocked eyes and regretfully said, "It would be much better if you could pretend to know nothing." The next second, the figures of the three cultists suddenly flickered violently in midair, and then disappeared. The spectral bird, its body wrapped in green fire and looking like a skeleton, hopped twice on Alexander's shoulder. Amid the crackling sound of the fire, it let out a sharp, hoarse cry, "Oh, the page is gone, try refreshing." The pigeon spoke in its usual humorous, quirky, and silly way. However, now it was a ghostly bird engulfed in phantom flames, its translucent flesh revealing a skeleton and tendons flowing with fire. Its squawks were mixed with the popping sounds of detonation, like the wailing of lost souls when the gates of the underworld are opened. It turns out that there's often not much distance between the strange and the funny. The spiritual fire still burned around Alexander, as he watched the three cultists disappear before his eyes. Unsure of the principles behind the process, all he knew was that this was Ice's ability. Several seconds later, when he was sure that the three cultists were truly gone, he slightly turned his head and asked the pigeon on his shoulder, "Where did you send them?" I flapped its wings, preening its now translucent feathers with its beak. After a while, it suddenly blurted out, "Back into the shadows." Alexander frowned. He had recently begun to understand the true meaning behind Ice words. "You mean, you banished them into some sort of parallel space? Or turned them into some untouchable state?" The pigeon lifted its head, its eyes flickering as it looked at Alexander. "Coo-coo." It was pretending to be a real pigeon again, but Alexander believed he understood the truth. He tapped Ice's head with his finger, then once again looked around the dimly lit sanctuary. In the flickering light of the oil lamp, everything in the small room was clear. The followers of the sun god who had once hidden here had completely vanished from this world. All that remained was a ghostly captain who had taken over the body of a cultist, and his pigeon. However, Alexander had a feeling. He felt as if the three cultists were still here, right by his side, trapped in the room, stuck in a dimension that could not be detected or touched by any means that he could even feel, the cultists screaming and struggling in vain. Their despair as they tried to reconnect with the real world but were permanently blocked by an invisible barrier. This feeling lingered. Until at one point, Alexander saw evidence. In the flicker of the oil lamp on the table, at just the right interplay of light and shadow, he suddenly saw a mark appear on the nearby wall. It looked like the mark left by a dagger being forcefully swung, but when he looked again, the flame of the oil lamp flickered once more, and the mark on the wall disappeared without a trace. That was the last contact the three followers of the sun god had with the real world. Alexander took a deep breath, turned around with the pigeon, and left the room. Outside the abandoned lounge was a corridor much narrower than the sewer tunnel he had seen before. The long, deep corridor extended in both directions, one end leading to a fork in the road, the other to a slope inclined upwards. Even in the abandoned areas, the city's administrators clearly maintained the most basic upkeep of these underground facilities. At least, the gas lamps on both sides of the corridor were still lit. Alexander quickly judged the direction of the corridor, and according to the residual fragments of memory in his mind, he quickly walked towards the upward slope. He walked faster and faster. Fresh air was now present. The cool wind blew against Alexander's hair. He heard some vague distant noises, which seemed to be the rumbling of some surface factory facilities operating all night, and the even more distant sound of sea waves. It was the sound of the evening waves crashing against the coastal rocks. Alexander almost started to jog. The pigeon, whose body had returned to normal after shedding the spiritual fire, flapped its wings on his shoulder, making happy noises. The era is calling. The era is calling. Alexander suddenly stopped. He stared into the pigeon's eyes. "Don't speak randomly outside. A normal pigeon doesn't talk." I thought for a moment, flapping its wings vigorously. "Captain." Alexander was taken aback, because the pigeon had actually responded correctly for once. He didn't know if this was a coincidence or what, but soon he stopped thinking about it. He had to prepare to face this world. The black robe he wore was definitely not suitable to be worn outside. In the devoured memories, this suspicious robe was only used in the secret ceremonies of the sun god cultists. In the streets of the city, this outfit was definitely to be tied to a tree and beaten by 7 or 8 security officers as soon as it appeared. There was a strict curfew enforced in the city-state of Prand. Walking around at night seemed to be a very dangerous thing. Ordinary people who want to go out at night must hold a pass and report in advance. Obviously, the cultist whose body he now occupied did not have these legal procedures, so he had to avoid those who patrol at night if he wanted to move around the city. The people responsible for maintaining order in the city at night are called guardians. They seem to be the armed forces under the Deep Sea Church. In the devoured memories, the original owner of this body had a deep fear and hostility towards these armed priests. Alexander quickly sorted through the fragments of memory in his mind. As the memories were inherited from a corpse, most of the fragments were chaotic and vague. He could not piece together a complete life trajectory of a modern civilized society member from them, nor could he piece together all the information about the city-state of Prand. But even the most basic parts were enough to give him a rough idea of what to do next. First, he took off the black robe at the entrance of the slope leading to the surface. Underneath the black robe were normal clothes, which wouldn't attract suspicion when walking outside. He considered whether or not he should burn the black robe, but the fire and smoke might attract the attention of the patrollers, so in the end, he just rolled up the black robe and hid it in a corner near the slope. The sun amulet was also a potential problem, but it might also contain valuable information. After much hesitation, Alexander decided to take it with him. He could use the amulet for another test when he returned to the Wanderer, to see if I could take it back. He could study it safely on the Wanderer. He dealt with the traces of hiding the black robe, and then roughly tidied up his appearance, trying to make himself look like an ordinary citizen, not a cultist who was hiding in the sewer and looking miserable. After all this, he walked up the slope. The rest of the journey wasn't too far. Alexander walked quickly up the slope. The increasingly fresh air filled his lungs. He could clearly hear the distant sounds of factories and sea waves, and a few minutes later, he even saw a cold light appearing on the steps not far ahead. He took a few quick steps forward, and the cold light finally enveloped him completely. He had reached the surface. The solid, stable ground bathed in pale light. Alexander's eyes Widened, he saw a city standing on the boundless sea, representing human civilization. The massive scar in the sky crossed over the city, illuminating the overlapping roofs, towers, and distant buildings. Not far in front of him was the slightly run-down outskirts of the city, and on the distant high ground, he could see many distant and majestic buildings. That was the upper city, where the cathedral and the city hall were located. Alexander suddenly laughed. He didn't make a sound, but he was gasping for breath. But after a moment, he forced himself to stop laughing. He took a deep breath in the cold night wind, then strode towards a direction in his memory. Cultists also have their own normal lives. Apart from a few priests who are completely devoted to harming humanity, the Sun Church, like most other cults, relies on a large number of ordinary people to support its operations. These deceived grassroots believers are mostly poor citizens of the lower city, neglected elderly people, naive teenagers, or like the body Alexander now occupied, a normal person who is ignored, suffering from a serious illness, running a scam antique shop in the lower city, and struggling with life and taxes. The terrible life of this antique shop owner named Ron had ended. His debt with a certain evil god had been written off with his last breath, but he still left a place in this world, and Alexander quite liked this place. Vanna woke abruptly from a bizarre and chaotic dream, only to find the night still shrouding the world outside her window. The pallid, cold light of the world's creation gleamed on the windowsill, adorned with deep-sea runes, casting a serene tranquility. Yet, the images from her dream remained vivid in her mind. A large ship ablaze with ghostly green flames, emerged from the horizon where the sea met the sky. It swept over the entire city-state of Pran like a rolling mountain. Amidst the spectral flames, countless cries and mournful ballads echoed in unison, creating a tumultuous uproar as though threatening to overturn the world itself. Simultaneously, as the colossal ship descended, she saw a blazing sun rising from the depths of Prand, not the sun familiar to mankind, bound by ancient runes, but a celestial body burning like the ancient sun, described by sun worshippers. It rose from the heart of the city, its flames melting the earth, and all people seemed to melt like wax figures in the streets. In the midst of this inferno, the grand cathedral of the deep-sea church stood in silence. In her dream, she prayed to the cathedral, hoping for guidance from the storm goddess, but the cathedral only echoed with nonsensical bell tolls, and no guidance came. Vanna got up from her bed and walked to the window in her nightgown. She glanced at the still calm city and the world's creation in the sky, but the turmoil in her heart only intensified. Moments later, the young judge turned her gaze away from the city. She moved to the vanity near her bed and casually opened a drawer. Inside the drawer of the vanity lay a dagger, a curved ceremonial dagger. The runes symbolizing the deep-sea church shimmered faintly at the base of the blade, as if resonating with some unknown power. Vanna's gaze lingered on the shimmering runes for several seconds before she cut a wound in her palm with the blade. As the blood seeped out, she placed her hand across her chest, quietly invoking the name of the storm goddess, hoping to seek divine guidance. However, for some reason, all she heard were vague roars of waves. That psychic sensing state she usually entered with ease was nowhere to be found today. It was as if an invisible curtain had suddenly enveloped her, severing her connection with the storm goddess. Gamona. Vanna's brows knitted together. It was rare, but not unimaginable, for the connection between a believer and a deity to be disrupted. The complex relationship between the subspace and the real world was beyond human comprehension. Even the power of the gods could occasionally be affected by the subspace, the deep sea, and the spiritual realm, leading to temporary fluctuations in strength. Additionally, with the eternal turbulence and disputes between gods and ancient gods, it was possible for some believers to suddenly lose the voice of their deity in rare instances. But the storm goddess, Gamona, should not be like this. The boundless sea surrounds human civilization, and the power of the storm goddess permeates all dimensions and affects the whole reality. All gods could possibly lose contact with the real world. Even death occasionally left loopholes like resurrected, but the storm goddess could not. This was one of the reasons why the deep-sea church could become the most powerful church on the boundless sea. Was the problem with her? Vanna naturally began to question her own state, but looking at her palm, she saw that the wound she had just cut was healing rapidly. The blessing bestowed by the goddess was still present, and there was no delay in its effect. Vanna once again recalled the noisy and bizarre nightmare she had had, as well as the ominous signs she had seen in the past few days. There must be a connection between all these. A ghost ship ablaze with green flames. A ghost ship? Vanna quickly recalled and compared the knowledge of the occult she had in her mind, and her eyes suddenly became serious. She was not an expert in the field of navigation, and she rarely dealt with the absurd tales circulated among superstitious sailors, but even in the Orthodox Church scriptures, a ghost ship occupied a special position. It was an ill-omened ship that had returned from the subspace. Its captain was the terrifying Captain Alexander, who had caused the collapse and absorption of the border of the 13 islands of Vitharan a century ago. Vanna stood up abruptly from behind the vanity, but then she remembered. It was the middle of the night, and the archives of the cathedral, like any other library, were not open at night, and for safety reasons, she should also avoid discussing anything related to the dream with anyone within a few hours of the end of that premonition dream. If the dream really pointed to Captain Alexander, he was very likely to sense the discussion about him through the connection established by the dream. After all, he was a ghost who could return from the subspace. The safest course of action now was to wait patiently, wait for the sun to regain its dominance in the world, and wait for the connection established by the dream to gradually dissipate, before going to the archives to look up related information or discuss these ominous signs with the Archbishop in the cathedral. In any case, if these premonition dreams really pointed to Captain Alexander and were truly warning her that the legendary lost ship was watching Prand, then as the guardian of the city-state, she must prevent the terrifying ghost captain from landing at all costs. A tall, thin figure swiftly walked through the deserted streets of the lower city. His elongated silhouette flickered under the gas lamp. A completely unfamiliar city, completely unfamiliar buildings, vague memories in his mind, a quiet and eerie civilian district during curfew hours. Yet, as Alexander walked down these squalid alleys, his mood was unusually cheerful. He had succeeded, not only in performing the second spirit walk, but also in controlling a body to reach the surface. To reach the surface of the city-state of Prand. He was interacting with the civilized society of this world, observing the architecture and technology of this era with his own eyes, and the body he was using was a complete one, not open-minded, not imaginative, but a body that appeared normal on the outside, which would make his subsequent actions much easier. Honestly, the health condition of this body wasn't great. Even in the state of spirit walk where he could ignore most of the body's problems, Alexander could clearly feel the subhealth state of this body. But he had no complaints about it, and even found it perfectly normal. After all, based on his experience from these 2 times, spirit walk occupied the body of a corpse within a certain period after death. How could a lively body be a corpse? A distant bark echoed from the end of the alley. Alexander cautiously slowed his pace, hiding himself in the shadows between the buildings. He didn't know if it was a patrol dog led by the church's night guard, but it was always better to be cautious. Above the nearby buildings, large pipe structures spanned across the low-rise houses. The light from the pale star spilled intermittent shadows between the pipes, and steam occasionally leaked from some pipe valves, forming a hazy fog in the night. The barking faded. Alexander emerged from his hiding place and surveyed the street for any movement. He then gently stroked the pigeon AI, who was restless on his shoulder, before following his memories across the street. Among a row of low-rise 2- or 3-story buildings, there was an old door. Above it hung a grimy sign, and on either side of the wall, you could see the dusty and neglected display windows. It was a shop, seemingly of decent size, but clearly lacking in upkeep and doing poor business. This was the place where the fragmented memories in his mind had guided Alexander. He stood before the old door, looking up at the sign above it. The letters were barely discernible in the darkness. Ron's Antique Shop, Alexander murmured under his breath. Quite a straightforward name. With that, he began to fumble around the entrance. Due to the unclear memories in his mind, it took him a while to find the spare key hidden under a hook beneath the windowsill. The original owner of this body did not carry the key with him, nor did he carry any items that could identify him or lead him to this antique shop. This seemed to be the caution of a seasoned cultist, but to a ghost captain who could seize memories, such superficial caution was meaningless. Alexander unlocked the door to Ron's Antique Shop, quickly slipped inside, and swiftly shut the door behind him. The wooden door made a thud, but the sound did not travel far into the night. The sign hanging above the door tilted slightly from the vibration. The letters on the sign wriggled in the pale, cold night, and in the blink of an eye, new words appeared on the wooden board: Alexander's Antique Shop.